since lockdown. I wrote. I've read all sorts of things. I've written this book, which is Mrs. Darcy versus the Aliens, which I guess is a crossover book of a sort, and written.
Well, it's humorous, it's historical, and it's science fiction. I mean,
yeah, absolutely. It's got the whole lot. Short stories, slim volume of poetry, music memoir, and more recently, mathematical mysteries. The third of which came out 2 days ago. So I'll be putting stuff about that on the chat. Yeah, now I'd like to recommend this one, which you probably all see. You saw the Jonathan Strange Mr. Norrell, which is essentially a Regency novel with added wizards, and it's great and it works perfectly. And it's a really fantastic novel for integrating the sort of the magical stuff in with the sort of historical Regency stuff, and it works absolutely brilliantly. It's great.
Oh, that's cool. That's a good recommendation. Mike.
Hi, I'm Mike Carey. I also write as M.R. Carey. I write in a number of different media, mostly fantasy, straying into horror and sci-fi. With the Felix Castor novels, which were sort of supernatural crime thrillers, sold as urban fantasy. I'd like to recommend another Nick Farquhar, actually, Gone Away World, which was his debut novel, which is an amazing post-apocalyptic sci-fi novel. It's also the best kung fu movie that you've ever read, and it has a terrifying existential mystery at the heart of it, as the protagonist's world is overturned, and he tries to figure out why all of the people who should love him and support him are suddenly hating him and trying to destroy him.
That's pretty cool. And Adrian.
Hello. Yes, Adrian Tchaikovsky. I write a wide variety of science fiction and fantasy type stuff. Cross-genre recommendations. If she wasn't in the panel, I probably would be recommending The Tea Master and the Detective by Aliette, as that is a...
Pretend for a moment that she is not there. And
well,
you know.
Given that she's here to speak for herself, I will also put a word in for Emma Newman's Planetfall series, especially After Atlas and Atlas Alone, which are... I think they perfectly combine that logical build-up and process that crime and science fiction both share in sort of both in breaking down the crime that has occurred and investigating it, and also in using the resources of the science fiction world to investigate that crime.
Right. Okay. And just a brief thing about me. I'm Kevin Henney. I write across a number of genres. It's my ambition to never write a novel. I've been very successful with that ambition. I write short stories and flash fiction, and have been unencumbered by the worries of a novel. Although I have published technical books, if you need a good nap, I honestly recommend my software stuff. But I'm going to, I will make a recommendation on this one. And I was wondering if Gareth was going to make it, because I know we both like David Mitchell and Cloud Atlas. It's not crime, but it is an ultimate genre mashup in many senses. It brings so many different storytelling styles as well as genre concepts together. It has quite an architecture, that book. But let's the thing I'd like to kind of kick off with is an initial question about, without getting too meta about genres, we do recognize, you can kind of recognize genres informally, in the sense that people will go to certain parts of bookstores, or they will say, I am reading a such and such book, regardless of the truth of these labels, or they will turn up at various conventions. They will go to BristolCon or Crime Fest, and these are centered around something, even if they are not, even if genres do not have tidy boundaries. But something that's popped up a couple of times in your recommendations is, particularly with almost detective procedurals and so on, is the idea of one obvious way of mixing genres is the use of the anatomy and logic of one genre. So say a crime, we'll have the structure of a crime, but we have the settings and the trappings, the scenery, if you like. The stage might be that of space opera, it might be that of fantasy, it might be that of historical. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on, is this is this a good way to think about how genres, a simple way that genres can sometimes mix? Whoever wants to dive in.
I think murders, from a storytelling point of view, are very handy things to hang a plot on, because they immediately give you stakes and a mystery, and narrative propulsion in that we have to find out who did this before they do it again. So from that point of view, I think you can drop a murder into any genre and immediately give yourself a plot. I did it with my Akak Makak trilogy. All 3 books start out basically as murders and then go out into the wider world.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. Yes, I mean, there are only 2 things you can write about, life and death. And so that's a good, but I did notice that with Akak Makak is that it felt very different. It did not feel like a science fiction book to start off with. This felt very detective-y. Was that intentional, or was that just the way that you channeled it?
Well, it was supposed to be a murder mystery book, but then added monkeys and zeppelins happened. It all got out of my control.
And of course, don't we all know that problem?
I tend to think of it as you have like so you've got the plot, you've got the characters, and you've got the world building, and you kind of, as the author, you can introduce unfamiliar elements in one of those 3, maybe 2 of those 3, but you cannot like make everything unfamiliar at once. I mean, you can, but it takes great skill. So what very often happens is you have very complicated world building, quite complex characters, and then a murder plot is kind of a very easy way to get something that's recognizable, that's got thrust, and that we all know the beats of, because we've all read, cozy mysteries. A lot of us have watched police procedural. It's a very familiar and comforting shape, whereas a space station crawling with xenoforms or whatever might be familiar in a different way, but might also be very out there for some readers. So in that sense, I think having something that is very recognizable, such as crime, is a very easy way to do it. And as Gareth said, it also immediately establishes a thrust for the story and a frame, which is, okay, the main question we're asking is who killed this person, or who stole those things, and then how we're going to visit justice upon them, or how are we going to solve it, how are we going to answer the question.
There's
a lot of
sorry.
And I think also a lot of SF, there's a subgenre of SF that operates with what I call the sort of murder investigation, which is we have this big dumb object in space and we're going to figure out what it is, which I think owes as much as crime stories as it does to scientific research. It's not actually how scientific research works per se, but it's the question at the heart of it, which is, how does it work? How did it come to be? And how do we unravel the first few, decades or centuries or anything that led to the construction of this object? So there's been quite a few ways of mixing and matching that have been tried.
There's an analogy with music. If a piece of music starts in a particular key, you expect it to resolve in that key. And it's the same with the story. It's the mechanics of setup and payoff operate differently in different genres. And there's a lot of power, I think, in keeping the genre space ambiguous to a certain extent. If the reader isn't certain which set of rules are operating, it can be unclear the direction the story is taking. There's a sort of very, very pleasant frustration of expectations. I think Stuart Turton's Evil in Hardcastle is a great case in point. If that story is a straight mystery, then it's building towards the revelation of whodunit. But there's another element in it which might be time travel, which might be supernatural. Is this sci-fi? Is it a horror story? Because it promises different kinds of payoff depending on the answers to those questions.
I think it's interesting that setup and payoff. The language is very, very similar whether you're looking at the big dumb object in space or the murder, because the idea as the writer how you are going to introduce the clues, how are you going to tell the story through fragmentary evidence that then draws together to what is hopefully a satisfactory conclusion.
Yeah.
On the downside, one thing I have seen where you've got someone who's very ensconced in one genre and kind of decides they're just going to have a go at the other without perhaps learning the language and traditions of it. You can often, if you have, say, a fantasy writer who says, well, I will make this story a murder mystery without really immersing themselves much in murder mysteries in and of themselves, you often find them doing, well, I will do this incredible device that no one's ever thought of, that every murder reader will immediately recognize from countless other stories. And the same going between any two genres. I think there can be a real temptation to see the grass is greener on the other side, and what they're doing over there looks terribly easy from my comfortable seat over here.
Yeah, I think that in particular that observation that Mike made against music, I think is a really good one. That idea is that you can move key, but you do expect to resolve back. If you watch any number of music theory videos, there's always this analysis of music of like, yeah, and then they go off and do this, and they even change music styles. Is a really interesting one. But again, there's that idea of those people over there doing something easy. And I kind of get that when people say, oh yeah, blues is easy because it's just like 3 chords and 5 notes and it's easy. It's just like, yeah, that's the ground floor. You need to get all the way up there. There's a great deal of sophistication. It's like, oh, that's what it takes to have a good one. So sometimes people will drop a spaceship or a detective in and hope that that's their blend. And they will use
that's a good point. Yeah. I think if you're going to write a sci-fi murder mystery, then the resolution of the murder mystery must be science fictional. There would be no point in just having a sci-fi murder mystery and finding out the vicar did it. Because, yeah.
The vicar's a robot. Oh, no.
Yeah. Or if it's a fantasy murder mystery, then the fantasy world that you've created must play into how it was done or why it was done. Otherwise, there's no point putting those elements into a sci-fi or a fantasy story, because you might as well just write them as a straight crime story.
I mean, isn't that the case for something that's going to appeal to genre readers, like to SF readers and as fantasy readers, right? You want, as an SF and fantasy readers, you want the SF and the fantasy to be integral to the plot, because I've read a bunch of like crime mysteries or even paranormals where it doesn't really hinge on the magic itself, right? And people are mostly in it for the characters. If it's a paranormal romance, you're mostly in it for the romance, right? I think it's like a question of like, where are you putting your focus? And as an SF reader, you would probably find that terribly disappointing, because you want the crunchy world building, you want, you know, the new technology, the magic and all that. But the people who, you know, if I'm reading it for the romance, I'm like, okay, fine. The trappings of romance are what's most important to me. It feels more like, where are you putting the focus and which genre are you choosing to put to the fore, is what Mike was saying about like, what kind of question are you setting up at the start? And then what are you driving? What is your key? And then what is your major key? What is your majority key, right?
So as a genre reader, I might like the trappings of the technology, but I also like perhaps the logic of a detective story, but the resolution of that must be in the genre, which is the dominant genre. So there's this idea that in genre mixing, we can often identify perhaps the basic frame and say, here is the dominant frame. This is where we started. Other elements may mix in the way that subplots mix in, but the dominant, there is still something we could identify as perhaps more dominant than the others.
Primi, you mix quite a few genres in your novels, right? How did that happen?
I still don't know, and it keeps happening in my short stories as well. And I know I tweet about this a lot, but I'm very interested in the elements of individual genres, but I'm not very interested in keeping them apart. So that's how you end up with stuff like magic in a futuristic sci-fi environment, or you end up with elder gods or whatever. And I don't think there's much of a point to genre purism. I don't know. I like it when things touch.
We are really fortunate that we're living in the age of the genre mashup, aren't we? It's almost a post-genre era.
Yeah.
Okay, now we're going to So this is the first time we're going to try the revolving panel thing. So let's see if we can do this without too much trouble. So hopefully Anne is there, ready to power this through. So we are going to bid farewell, but only briefly, to Gareth, Aliette, and Primi. They will be back in the final revolution. So they get the last word as well.
Do we need to leave the meeting while we're just being downgraded?
No, I think Anne is going to hopefully magic this.
Okay.
And we are going to welcome in Sarah Hillary, Sangeeta Kay, and Emily Koch. So let's just see if that will happen.
Yeah, sorry, I've just turned my audio back on. It's Anne.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Aliette, don't leave the meeting. I will demote you to attendee so that your video and audio disappear.
We've got so much vocabulary going on. We've got demotion, we've got disappearing, decloak. I'm going to have to throw some Blade Runner retirement here as well. We're going to retire people, albeit temporarily.
Who else am I retiring? I've retired Aliette. I'm retiring
Gareth
and Gareth. Yes.
And then we're bringing
bye, Gareth,
Sangeeta, and Emily online.
I mean, this is basically the bit in the Matrix where they pull the plug out from the back of the.
Yeah. I mean, you know, you thought you were in the real world, but really this is the Matrix.
Still haven't resolved what would happen if you were in a Zoom breakout room when the room closed, whether you actually disappear.
That experiment can be run at around 5:30.
We might need a volunteer. My mother-in-law declined to volunteer for that test.
And we're almost fully crime laden.
I think that should be everybody.
Right.
I'm muting myself again.
Brilliant. So Sangeeta and Emily, you both have your mics muted. Sarah.
Hello.
If I could ask you to introduce yourself, your writing, and any recommendations for cross-genre book.
Absolutely. So I'm Sarah Hillary. I'm the author of the Marnie Rome police series. I have been known to write some horror, dabbled a tiny bit in sci-fi when I used to write flash fiction, which I don't write as much now as I'd like to, but I am working on a Japanese ghost story, short story, which I'm quite excited about. I would like to recommend The Shining Girls by Lauren Bucas, which is a really perfectly pitched mashup. It's a serial killing murder mystery involving time travel. What I really love about it is the way that Lauren respects both the genres equally. So she doesn't mess about with the time travel. She obeys the laws that you would expect, I think, as a sci-fi time travel genre fan. But she absolutely nails the humanity and the personal stories of the victims and the pursuit of the serial killer and the empathy and all of those things that are in really, really good, compelling crime fiction.
Yeah, I have to agree with you on that one. I think it's a wonderful book, and it does sit very comfortably in that sense. You know, it's one of those things of, if you're to recommend it, who's asking? What do you normally read? Well, I'll frame it in those terms. It is very well balanced. Sangeeta.
So I'm Sangeeta Kay, and my last psychological thriller is 1 Year Later. Came out in August. Funnily enough, or not funnily at all, it's set on a remote island off the coast of Italy, and it's 10 people on this tiny island, almost locked into a house together. Quite a pressure cooker situation. A child has been killed a year before, and all the people who were there when this child died are all in this house together. And in terms of my, so the other thing to say is that before I started writing psychological thrillers, I used to write literary fiction under my own name, which is O'Connell. And then before that, I wrote all unpublished science fiction, which was my first love. So you never know, might be able to go back after this with all your good tips about how to do a genre mashup. My favourite kind of mixed genre book or books are the Mad Adam trilogy by Margaret Atwood. She doesn't call them science fiction, she calls them speculative fiction, and they're marketed as literary fiction. But all the really kind of amazing cross-genre experiences that I've come across have been on TV, actually, like Carnival Row. I mean, that's a Jane Austen period piece mixed with fantasy and police procedural, you know, crime.
Excellent. Yeah. And yeah, we've got a Jane Austen expert, John, you know.
Absolutely.
Emily.
Hi there. So my name's Emily Koch. My second novel is this Keep Him Close, which came out last month. It's a dark domestic drama about the friendship between a woman whose son has died and the mother of the boy accused of his murder. So yes, that's my latest book. The book I'd like to recommend is one, so it's not sci-fi, it's more on the kind of speculative realm, but Our Endless Numbered Days by Claire Fuller. So it's about a little girl, Peggy, whose father thinks the world is about to end. So it's a kind of apocalyptic novel in that way. He takes her from London, this is in the 70s, takes her off to a remote European woodland, and then things kind of start to go wrong. So it's a very dark thriller. So yeah, that's my recommendation. It's a fantastic book.
That's a good one. Well, I'm gonna sort of take a question from the chat. This is from Richard Webb. How do the panelists think depictions of crime, solving crime, will change to incorporate emerging technologies? And obviously we're all old enough to have lived through these changes of technologies, such as AI, robotics, VR, wearable tech, and in fact, referring back to Sarah's recommendation of The Shining Girls, I know that Lauren Bucas set that, everything in that is set before 1992, 93. I remember seeing, she gave a talk a few years ago on this because she wanted the pre-internet era. She didn't want anybody to be able to look anything up online. So she intentionally set the story without modern technology. So here, I guess we're asking the reverse question. What do we fully embrace this? What are we expecting will change in our genres, perhaps our genre mix and match, and in the world of crime?
We're not going to do the constant thing of having the mobile phones break down or out of signal and that sort of stuff. Such a trope.
I don't know, in this post-pandemic era that we'll hopefully one day in the not too distant future be living in, it might not be unrealistic, you know, that we can go, you know, back to a time when things did go wrong and were outside our control. I honestly do feel, I mean, I can understand exactly why Lauren did that with her book, because I feel that, and I'm pretty sure that this is why the best crime that I read certainly focuses much more on the characters and their personal, you know, mysteries and struggles to resolve and meet some sort of emotional justice, rather than the solving of crimes per se using the technology, although that's in there to an extent. I was very reassured at the St. Hilda's Crime Fiction Weekend last August to see a forensic expert talking about how the huge gaps and failures in DNA and forensic evidence that everybody assumes is watertight and the way forward. So I think the great joy will be those little wriggle room areas between, you know, when AI is in, how it goes wrong. I mean, I straight away just think of something like Alien and the whole of the Alien franchise. I mean, that's AI, but AI misfiring hugely and the human consequences of that. I think for my money, the story always needs to come back to a human touch point, and too much technology, I do find, can get in the way of that, or make it less interesting, perhaps. If you can you know, look up Google Earth to find out what one day your soft shoe detective used to go and pound the streets, and that made a really interesting story for my money, much more so than, you know, when the internet can do away with a lot of that stuff. But what do you guys think? What do the rest of you think?
I think that there is actually a real opportunity, especially if you're trying to create a bit of a creepy or supernatural vibe, to just go with all the technology you can get your hands on. Because one of the things we've all been discovering, I suspect, in this whole lockdown business is things don't work. And things don't work for reasons that nobody can work out why they don't work.
Absolutely.
And I mean, in Doors of Eden, which is the book I've got coming out later this year, a date which is being pushed back as we speak. One of the very minor devices I've got in is people getting calls on their phones that then don't show in the log, and there's no evidence you ever got that call. getting an email from an unknown address, your computer suddenly bringing up a website that's really strange, looking something up on Google Earth and finding out that place that you went to last year doesn't appear to exist. You can use all of this technology to really accentuate the feel of the world going wrong.
Yeah.
Because it is now so huge and faceless and all-encompassing that there is no one to appeal to. And frequently everything is so amendable and re-editable that you can't even go back to say, and look at this thing, because the evidence of the thing can have been completely disappeared.
It's the ultimate gaslighting, but through the technology we felt was reliable.
Yeah.
We lose the omniscience we assume is coming, suddenly it's gone. But yeah.
Well, as somebody who lives in a very remote area where there's no mobile signal, and our internet until very recently was running at 3 megabits a second, and Google Earth has moved where we live somewhere else, completely different, that is not accessible by road. And how can you get hold of Google? So I think even today, with the amount of technology we've got, there's plenty of gaps for crime to happen, particularly somewhere like this, very remote, where everyone has a chainsaw.
Thanks for that bit of colour there.
Let's all keep an eye out for Sanchita, please, over the coming days and weeks.
Yeah, just don't use Google Earth.
I think there's a real danger in trying to be up to the minute with technology, particularly if you're making the technology so that you're making the plot depend on a technological innovation. There's a Michael Crichton novel, I can't remember what it's called, but it's all about digital manipulation of images. And when he was writing it, he was talking about stuff that was cutting edge, and it's not cutting edge anymore. You read that book and it's like you're reading ancient history, and it's only 15, 20 years old.
I'm always surprised when other crime writers might say, or I can remember one time being absolutely obsessed with how could a crime be committed in a place where there was lots of CCTV, like the Tube. And I was thinking, but they'll have it on. But no, we don't need to worry about that. You just go, well, it was broken that night. Or they film it, they throw it away, because actually that happens a lot. That just genuinely, all you need is one case where that's happened in real life, and it becomes realistic. So I think sometimes we get too hung up on, the limitations as well as the opportunities of technology, and far better to write a story that's about character and emotions, and make the technology work within that. That would always be in the same way I retrofit my research. I wouldn't get hung up on the technology as the driving force. But I really love Adrian's idea about all those creepy gaps between the stuff. Yeah, there's so much opportunity in that.
I think there's an interesting, so from what people are saying, there's some interesting thoughts about sometimes there is a divorce, a story that is relatively timeless, if you like, at one level, or works with a slower kind of glacial pace in terms of the technology. So it still has the same kind of validity and feel, perhaps decades on. But then there are those stories that look for, that do the exact opposite and run towards it and say, and now let's look at the gaps. What might those be, or what happens when it's the going wrong question. I think we have to pick up Garrett's point from the first thing, throw a murder into a story and you've suddenly got a story. But also things that go wrong. We love things that go wrong.
Douglas Adams made an entire career out of that, didn't he?
Indeed, yes. And so there's this whole idea of, here is the thing, it's gone wrong. Perhaps somebody dies, or somebody has died. We don't know why, because the thing went wrong. We lack the knowledge we would normally have. So there's this opportunity, if you like, and that seems like a very different way of looking at the technology, the relationship.
I think all the best, all my favorite sci-fi stories in any case are all about how the technology leads to terrible catastrophic consequences for the humans involved, or our very uneasy relationship with technology. So Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Absolutely brilliant, because what you've done there is you've taken a detective, completely undermined his sense of reality, not just about the world in which he lives, but about himself ultimately by the end of it. And that's what that book's about. You could actually, in some ways, that's a classic modern detective story with a guy with demons who's trying to chase down bad guys who turn out to maybe, it's all about how much are any of us human, what happens to our humanity in extremis. And I think that's going to be a theme that I can see really coming out at the back end of the life that we're all living through at the moment, because isn't it fascinating, the things that are happening to human psychology right now, and the way in which we're all, you know, what our understanding is of being social or being in good health, how that's changing and flexing all the time because of all the crazy responses people are having to, you know, what the things fear does to us. You know, the things isolation does to us, and those are themes, I think, that, you know, as old as time, and you've got them in sci-fi. Some of their best forms are in sci-fi, I think.
If you look at The Expanse, which I think Aliette mentioned earlier, you know, the technology is almost a kind of a byproduct of what's going on. I love their equivalent of the iPhones, where they're just sort of doing gestures, and then all of a sudden they've got the solar system up in front of them, and that's just, it just happens. There's no sort of mention of it. But as Sarah says, the story is what's important. Even though it's, you know, set a couple of 100 years in the future, we're not wedded to the technology. We just sort of take it as read that they can, you know, travel these vast distances and use these very cool iPhones.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. Is that I think sometimes, and that's what, you know, in all good storytelling, is to make the extraordinary utterly ordinary in some sense. This is what they use, and there's nothing, it's only when something goes wrong do we want to draw attention to it, but all the stuff that works on an everyday basis does not need a laboured description.
Or just don't bother upgrading some of the stuff. Like, I mean, I think of Firefly, where they're sort of running around with 6 guns, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. Or honestly, that not upgrading thing is a very familiar experience these days. I mean, you know, are you up to date with your service packs, your latest release of Windows 10 and so on? And the half a dozen things don't work with anything else. It only takes 2 years. I'm always agog at all these films where thousands of years in the future, somebody's able to boot something up and we can barely do it. And 2 years, we've just, because of the time we have available, we've just purged the house of old tech recently. And honestly, when I say old tech, some of it's only 3 years old. It just doesn't connect to stuff anymore. Right, okay, so let us revolve the doors once again and bid Adrian, John and Mike a farewell. Hopefully you stick around, we'll come back, we'll have a kind of like a big panel at the end, and we'll bring everybody up and sort of to close everything. So we will see you briefly at the end. We will keep Sarah, Sanjita and Emily with us and invite on board Patrick, Michael and Derek. Let's see if this see if the revolution continues. Okay, that's half the story, that's good.
Yes, Paddy.
That's Michael. Excellent. Paddy, Mike, do you want to
yes.
unmute?
Hello, hi everyone.
Hello.
Sorry.
Hello.
Classic modern gaff music.
Sorry, is that everybody, Kevlin?
Yeah. Yes, it is. And Derek, if you want to unmute.
Muting myself again.
Excellent. Right. So, folks, new arrivals. I'll go in the order that I see them on my screen. So, Paddy, if you'd like to introduce yourself, tell us something about you, your writing, your work, and a recommendation of a book you feel straddles genres.
Yes. So, hi, I'm Patrick Edwards. I'm a novelist. My first book was straight up dystopian science fiction. Came out last year in March. My new book came out this March, and it looks like this. And that is in itself a mashup novel. It's which my publisher adored because they kept saying how hard it was to market it, which gave me just such glee. I don't know why. I love anyway. No one's going to buy it. Yes, no. It's so it's kind of half historical fiction and it's half dystopian future post Brexit sci-fi. And my recommendation for a mashup is, and this is just an excuse to talk about Haruki Murakami, whom I'm obsessed by. And this is a mashup of, it's the Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World. And it is a mixture of futuristic / well, it's quite hard to tell whether something's futuristic in Japan because it could just be now Japan and it just seems futuristic. But it's a mix up of that and this really weird sort of surreal, potentially a simulation fantasy world with alternating chapters, and is gloriously self-indulgent.
Excellent. Michael.
Hi, I'm Michael Rowley. I'm Senior Commissioning Editor at Rebellion Publishing, and a few of my authors are on today. I look after Adrian Walker and Dave Hutchison, and of course Derek Kunskin. So I'm going to avoid talking about a Solaris book as my pick, because that would be a bit awkward, I guess. But I'm going to go for something more lighthearted, and one of the series I've absolutely loved over the years is Jasper Ford's Thursday Next books, starting with The Air Affair, which are a wonderful mashup of crime, science fiction, just about everything actually literary that you could think of. And Thursday Next, for those of you who don't know the series, Thursday Next works for Spec Ops 27, which are the literature police. And they look after like missing manuscripts and characters who have been stolen from manuscripts. And the whole thing is a kind of surreal, cool, humorous thing that, I mean, you'd be hard pressed to not make the comparisons to Douglas Adams and people like that, of course, Dirk Gently and things like that. So in these troubling times, I think that's a good series to recommend to anybody, because they are just pure, unadulterated fun, but very cleverly weaving in the tropes of all sorts of different genres, specifically the crime genre.
Derek.
So hello from Gatineau, Quebec. I'm Derek Kunskin, and I write space opera. My first novel is The Quantum Magician. It came out about 18 months ago, and thanks to Michael, it's on sale now for $1.99 British money. So I write space opera, and it does have crime in it. This one is a heist. I was going to give a recommendation. I thought of Robert Holdstock's Mythico Wood and Lavendis as a sort of mashup of fantasy and horror. But after somebody mentioned Kung Fu, I wanted to then switch my recommendation to Fonda Lee's Jade City, which is basically Kung Fu plus The Godfather plus fantasy. And I thought that, she did so great at those, as did Robert Holdstock, but I just thought Jade City was a little more current.
Cool. Now, a fresh question from Sarah Hamilton. On that note from Paddy about being hard to market a mashup novel, as a new writer who doesn't have sales precedence, should debut writers avoid non-mashups? This is kind of an interesting one. It's we have people on the panel who you've all been debut writers. And people who are on the other side of the fence, and you're all readers. So, thoughts?
I mean, it was kind of a glib point, but it is a valid question. I think that if you're able to bring an entire boatload of passion to it, it doesn't really matter whether you're sticking to an absolute cast iron genre or whether you're choosing to. I think a genre can be a useful guardrail if that's your first book, because it's hard enough just to get to the end of a 90,000 word manuscript. That's an event in itself sometimes. So it can be a useful thing to have parameters, and then perhaps you can expand outwards afterwards. But if you are comfortable with your subject and your story, and your characters are singing, then I don't think you need to worry. It's your publisher's job to work out the marketing aspects, and they're very good at it. And as I said, it was a glib comment about marketing that I threw out there, but they did pull it off, and it actually took something that I think perhaps marketed with a Roman gladius on the front would have appealed to one crowd, or if it had got a post-Brexit burning landscape on it, it would have appealed to another crowd, but neither the twain would meet. But actually what they did is they put like a big kind of obscure, slightly like non-1984-esque eye on it, which I think actually people look at and they go, I don't know what that's about, but I quite like the cover, so I'm going to have a look at it. And I think actually in that respect, going mixed genre was an advantage, because it's not scaring anyone. And as I said, it's not your job as the novelist to worry about the marketing aspect. You've got enough to worry about as it is.
Well, exactly. I think from what I've learned from the industry since my first book came out a couple of years ago, it's not so much avoiding doing a mashup as your first novel, it's recognizing that whatever you do first, they're going to expect more of for your second and your third. That whatever you set out to do with your first novel, there are people who will do lots of different things and have very varied careers. But it's not an easy thing to do, because you've got to convince your publisher that that is going to be okay and that you're going to keep your readership along the way. So I mean, that would be my advice if you're planning to have a long career. By no means it can't be done, but just consider that the first book you write, they're going to want more of similar stuff. I don't know if that's other people's experience on the panel, but certainly mine.
My feeling, for what it's worth, my advice would be, don't be too hung up on what the nature of the genre, how the, you know, similar to what Paddy was saying, you know, it's your publisher's job ultimately to decide where it sits. And I think we just had a comment on the chat from an agent who's saying that cross genre can be harder, but it's all about the originality and it's all about the strength of the writing. And when I was writing, you know, getting my debut novel ready, it was very much, you know, the book I'd originally pitched to my agent wasn't the beginning of a police series, but I was told that's what everyone wants. They want a police series with a, you know, strong detective lead. That has completely altered in the 6 years since that happened, and now very few people are actually interested in police procedurals, certainly not new ones, are much harder to sell now. So, you know, that's flipped. It's the advice then has changed in the interim. So my feeling would be more to, you know, focus on telling the best story that you can tell. And if the best story you can tell is going to be, you know, a mashup, then, you know, go for it. And then, you know, but obviously, you know, when you've got your agent, when you've got your publisher, listen to their advice as well. And Emily's very good point. They will expect, they'll expect more or similar. I know that Belinda Bauer, when her debut novel Blacklands came out, and her publisher said, "So what's your second book going to be about?" And she said, "It's going to be about 2 kids on the moon." And the editor said, "No, it's not. It's going to be another crime novel." So we're still waiting for Belinda Bauer's book about the kids on the moon or in space or wherever, you know, something. She was going to write a sci-fi thing next, so she owes us one. But, you know, you do set off on a certain trajectory. I
think she's kind of made her peace with that, hasn't she? I've read kind of interviews with her where, so she writes crime fiction, but she doesn't stick to the rules, and she
definitely doesn't stick to the rules.
So she always makes sure there's a crime at the center of the novel or somewhere in the novel, but she really plays around with it.
Definitely.
I think publishers and agents are always looking for something different. So, you know, as I think it was Sarah said, that's where your originality is going to come. If it's going to be 2 different genres, my advice would be to research both those genres. What are the conventions in that genre? I mean, just to be very glib about it, if you're writing a love story, readers are going to expect lovers, and they're going to expect a kiss and a breakup and a makeup. Who falls in love and how? And you know, are they aliens or what? You know, that's where your originality is going to come. So if you know what your conventions are between the 2 or more genres, then you can work out how to make readers feel satisfied, even if they don't have a checklist of I'm looking for this in my novel. And also, as Emily said, you know, that's what your agent and publisher are going to expect more of next. I wrote my first after I wrote my first book, I wanted to write something that was more science fiction, and I was told, "You're not Margaret Atwood. Only Margaret Atwood can do this," and hence having to change my name to Kay, because publishers didn't want me to carry on with my literary fiction and then suddenly veer off into writing crime fiction. So I actually had to change my name in order to be able to change genre.
Yeah, it's like Ian Banks. It's an Ian Banks switcheroo where he just. Because he started with The Wasp Factory, which is it's as bizarre as everything that he writes, but it was like, I guess you could classify it as like literary or just sort of straight general fiction. And then he loved science fiction, so he went, I should pull the ultimate switcheroo by putting my middle initial and it becomes Ian. Complete. It's like Superman with the glasses. Like, it's a completely different writer. No, it's not, and you can tell there's like it's a great trick of him being able to just write whatever he wants within 2 completely separate areas, but subtly blend themes from the other, like in both into like individual novels within the separate personas that he was maintaining.
I was about to mention, had you not mentioned Ian Banks, I was going to mention, well, it's because the thing I find funny is the Ian M. Banks, his straight science fiction stuff is very clearly well categorized within its genre, but the Ian Banks stuff is all over the map. A lot of it would actually be classified as speculative. He does a lot of genre blending. Some of that, you kind of look at it and go, well, actually, shouldn't this have an M in the middle?
Massively. Transition. I'm looking up now because I've got a copy of the book Transition, which is like, it's science fiction, but it's not marketed as Ian M. Banks. So it's like, oh, which world am I living in? It's almost like it doesn't really matter. And whether the writer, you just like and enjoy their style, and it doesn't really matter too much whether they're writing about the culture or like my other favorite Ian Banks, which I'll drop in, which is The Business, which is an amazing novel.
Yes.
Ian Banks, of course, he was he said several times at events that I was at, when I was at Waterstones, that he of course wrote science fiction first and couldn't get it published, and in the end he wrote The Wasp Factory and it became very successful, and then of course it allowed him to publish his science fiction, and I imagine there was that conversation, I can only imagine, with his publisher, where it was like, well, maybe we need to rebrand you slightly, but certainly as the buyer at Waterstones for science fiction at the time, when we were very reliably, every other year we got a science fiction book. So as the science fiction buyer, every other year you knew you were going to get an Ian Banks science fiction novel, you were going to sell X thousands of copies, and and then the one year it wasn't. It was a mainstream fiction novel, but it was actually one of the ones that you could have put in either. I was like, no, that's our book. This year's my turn. I need that book this year. My budget's gone. It was like, Ian, you've let me down. The late great Ian Banks. He's genre bending from book to book. It was fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, some of his, as Ian Banks, he wrote post-apocalypse stuff. It was right. Now we are going to draw this third revolution to a close, and we're going to take a break for you out there, because we've talked about the human condition. We are only human. We're going to take a 5-minute break. So we're going to bid Sarah, Sanjita, and Emily farewell. Hopefully they'll come back at the end so we can have a screen full of panelists and any final words to be said on that. And in 5 minutes time, Paddy, Michael, and Derek will stick around. And in 5 minutes time, we will have 3 more, and Adrian and maybe Dave. We will see how that one goes. He's been having, we talked about technology that doesn't work. Well, Dave Hutchison has been in that experience now, but not as science fiction. Okay, so 5-minute break. Anything else?
So saying 5-minute break, I'll put the panelists where they should be for when we come back, and I would suggest everyone just turns their microphones off if they're popping to get a drink or whatever, and I'll turn them on when we come back.
Can we talk amongst ourselves?
Actually, I could just mute everybody, couldn't I? I have the power to do that.
No, Paddy.
That's exactly that.
No. Mute yourselves. I don't think I can do a mute all on panelists.
Not sinister at all.
It's going to my head a little. I would say.
Great power. Yeah, we know that line.
I have no responsibility. Yes, if everyone just mutes themselves, and we'll see you back here in a couple of minutes. Cool. Okay. Change on to attendee.
Hey, Michael.
Hey, Derek.
We're the last ones here.
We're illegally talking. And it's recording, Derek. It's recording. So be careful what you say.
I was going to ask if there are consequences if we didn't mute and if we talked during the 5 minutes.
I don't know. I think Anne will shut us off if we need to be. Yeah.
No, you're fine. It's just occurred to me that we don't have Dave because of the tech issues. He's supposed to be in on this rotation. I'm just wondering whether I drop somebody else in. I might send a message saying, do we have any volunteers?
Do Premi, then it's the Solaris Fest.
I can message her.
Or Adrian, other Adrian.
I'll just send it all panelists.
Premi just said I can come in.
Oh yeah, okay, fine. Oh, hang on, Paddy's just. Is Paddy supposed to be here? Oh yes, you are. Sorry. About to put you back out again there. Okay, I'll put Premi in then.
Please don't kill me. I know you have the power to do it.
You're all making me out to be some kind of megalomaniac.
I'm not making. No, I mean.
But I think it's fun to have big bads around, right? You can't have great stories without great villains.
Right, I'm going to promote Premi to the panelist and then grab my tea. Back a sec.
Did Dave not make it then?
That also sounds very ominous.
Sorry, yeah, that did actually, didn't it?
You might be hiding from me because I want to ask him to write something, so you know.
A nasty feeling I've just made myself a really disgusting cup of tea from doing it really fast.
Oh, that's another thing, Adrian, from your book. Firstly, like disturbing parallels with being shut in with a 3-year-old. Granted, I'm not in a basement, but still. The other thing is you describe this bit where he feels really inadequate because he doesn't know how to make tea properly. And it made me feel awful. I was like, no, that's how I make tea. I squeeze the bag against the edge of the cup.
Oh, I do that.
And now, yeah. And now
my earphones have been.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. No, I was just saying there's a bit in End of the Roll Running Club where you talk about how he feels really inadequate because
the tea bit.
He can't make the tea bit. And I was like, no, that's me. It's just hitting me in all. It's it's a dad stuff, tea stuff. I can't cope.
Okay.
Yeah.
The bit that I always remember from that is when they're frantically trying to get safe, and he's forgotten the bunny rabbit. Is it? So
Run upstairs, get the bunnies. Yeah.
Screaming at him to get the toy, and he's
Adrian, that's from experience.
Adrian, did I give you a note, Adrian, and the human son on making tea? Was it you? There's something about boiling water and the water not being boiling, and I was like, no, it's got to be boiling water.
Yeah, I seem to put tea in a lot of my books, don't I?
The whole thing on how to make a cup of tea.
This might only apply to Japanese tea, but when I went over there, they had like a special tea device. It wasn't as boring as a kettle. It was like a special. It heated it to exactly 80 degrees, which was considered to be the optimum temperature for like matcha tea. So I was like, maybe all tea is meant to be that temperature, but I guess. Should we just talk about tea?
I'd watch my agent Lisa.
I'm not qualified to talk about tea.
Well, Lisa gets very upset about the number of times people make hot drinks in books just to fill in space.
We could do one for our American viewers to sort of, explain to them how one should make tea, because of course it doesn't really happen very well in the States.
Honestly, I drink coffee, so I have no idea, So,
what's your method of making tea, Michael?
Well, it's just that the water should be boiling.
Yeah,
when you pour
straight
it
out of the kettle.
Yeah. Whereas often in America, it's just from one of these hot taps, which you can conceivably make coffee from, but you shouldn't really make tea from. It's not. It's not proper.
Stood for a while as well, so I wouldn't have said you make coffee from it either. So.
I mean, I don't disagree.
So, Anne, have we lost Dave to technology?
I think we have. I'm just going to double check the attendee list. I haven't seen him screaming. He didn't sound hopeful. He said he'd been trying to get his laptop to work, and it wouldn't run for more than 10 minutes at a time before cutting out. No, we don't have him.
Right. Okay. Well, that's cool. Got one less person to introduce, so that we right. So the next, so who we got up next? So that will be.
So we replaced Dave with Premi. I don't think you were here when we did that.
Oh no, that's fine. Yeah. So Premi, you can have an extended slot. Brilliant. You can be in slots. Yeah, perfect. Right. So I guess whenever we're ready, we can.
Yeah.
We're good to go. Right. Okay. And welcome back. And I hope you have managed to find your drink of choice. I'm not going to assume time zones or your favorites. So we're going to, so we have lost Dave Hutchinson to technology, sadly, but we're going to welcome back Premi a little earlier. So I would like to welcome in for the first time. Well, we've already seen Anne, but now as a panelist rather than as the host and organizer, and also Adrian. So Anne, please.
So I'm Anne. My debut novel was out a couple of years ago, Space Between the Stars, which I do have in this pile. That's it. It is SF in the sense that there are spaceships and people on other planets. I didn't actually set out intending to write SF. I think I talked about this at the last event. I wanted to write about isolation and somebody being impossibly far from home. And really the only way to do that was to have them on the other side on the face of it, in uncrossable space. So I sort of fell into speculative fiction, although I've always read it and I do love it. And pretty much everything I write in terms of short stories tends to take a bit of a U-turn or a 90-degree turn into speculative somewhere along the line, no matter how mainstream it starts out.
So in other words, really it's what the genre can offer you in terms of accentuating something such as distance.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a framework to tell a human story.
Yeah, excellent. And recommendation for?
Oh, yes. I recommend this in all sorts of scenarios, but John Connolly, the Irish crime writer who writes about New England, the Charlie Parker series. I mean, it is crime stroke psychological, but there is a supernatural undercurrent. And it's that kind of, is it not, is it all in his head? I think we've kind of got to the point where, no, it's not all in his head, but there's an awful lot about what people believe and what they're doing because of what they believe, rather than it necessarily being the doings of the thing they believe in. But the main thing about John Connolly is I think he writes absolutely beautifully. He writes like poetry. He has quite a few sections about what he calls the honeycomb world and what's beneath what we can see. And it's just stunning.
Yeah, I second that. I mean, he's got an uncanny ability to write Charlie Parker's character going through those adventures. And I'm a few books behind, I must confess, and it's almost like for the people that want it to be supernatural, it is, but there's always this, or is it kind of question mark. There's always, or is it in his head? Is he damaged? Is he, is he an unreliable narrator? And I don't think I've ever seen that done quite so well as in those books.
He's brilliant. He's absolutely brilliant. Fantastic. I also met him briefly at Worldcon. He's absolutely hysterical. Really funny guy.
Adrian.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Adrian Walker. I'm the author of The End of the World Running Club, amongst other books. I've got another one out at the end of this month called The Human Sun. I guess you could call me a speculative fiction writer, but actually this is quite an interesting panel for me to be on, because I get my mind sort of tied up in knots when I think about genre and genre writing, because I never really set out to write in any particular genre, probably like a lot of writers. And it might sound stupid, but I never really grew up thinking that there was just this divide between genres either. I sort of read between literary and horror and science fiction. I never really sort of gravitated to one. I think I tend to read any book that has a strong voice and that asks interesting questions. So that's what I tend to try and write as well. But I guess if I had any ambition as a writer, it would be to not to mash up genres, but to defy genres, because I do think that they can get in the way of your writing a little bit. And in that spirit, my book recommendations will be genre-defying books. one of which is I, Lucifer by Glenn Duncan, which is one of my favourite books, and Life After Life by Kate Atkinson, which I'm currently reading. And both of those, I suppose, live within a certain genre, but they tend to ignore it in a very effective way, I think. And that's something that I try to do in my writing as well.
Oh, that's brilliant. So actually, this is a sort of a small housekeeping note. You as the audience, if you find yourself following up on what you've seen here, if you're inspired to write a blog post about anything, don't forget to hashtag us, hashtag Wi-Fi Sci-Fi, a very hashtag friendly name. But also, can I ask the panelists, I've had a request from Grace Palmer, if you could, at some point when you have a moment, but for those of you not currently active on the panel, you can do this now, but if you could put your recommendations in the chat, because these are all good books you've been mentioning, and actually some people have not been able to just track that as well as what you've been saying about it. So if you could put your recommendations up, that'd be much appreciated. So I'm going to ask, pick up a question here from Dan Stubbings. What was the hardest part of your first novel, and how did you overcome it? And Michael, I know that you're from the other side of the fence. I've got a question for you as well, which is going to be slightly separate. But to those we have available to us now,
I can start with a confessional. I think beginnings still kill me, and the beginning of The Quantum Magician, I think I rewrote 9 times, and just getting the sequence of where the story to start was really hard. And to overcome it, I think it was just a matter of trying and trying and trying. It almost became trial and error. Like my agent would say, nope, still don't think it's working. Nope, still don't think it's working. And it was, you know, flinging myself at a brick wall until finally the brick wall went down a little bit.
Or at least it felt like the brick wall, not you, was going down.
I feel I totally hurt that brick wall by smashing myself into it.
Just out of interest, I mean, that's that notion of revision of the beginning. We often hear about writers revising, spend a lot of time revising it. That revision of the beginning, perhaps people don't talk about it enough, but was it one of the, did you find that was one of the last things you did?
Yeah, it definitely was, because we'd gotten to a draft 8 with my agent, and then I was feeling like, okay, I'm finally done. This is great. And then I got an email that like, it's almost done. Let's just try the beginning one more time.
I love that feeling, that fleeting, lying feeling. Yes, it's done. Oh, never.
When I was, it's like when you're in the military and they're like, okay, 60 push-ups, and then you do your 60 push-ups, and then they're like, now 1 for the queen, and then you do your 1, and then they're like 1 for the regiment. It's like, oh my God, you're awful.
I've got to say, I agree about that. Sorry, Adrian.
That's all right, you go for it.
And I agree about the openings being just so hard. Oddly, the only one that I found of anything I've attempted or finished that I found the opening easy was the one that did actually finish up getting published first. Everything else, the openings have been rewritten and rewritten and rewritten. And the number of people I've spoken to or heard talking on writing who've said, don't do that, because the opening will inevitably be revised much further down the line when you're going through the editing process. But there's something about that opening chapter. It's impossible to leave it alone and move on. I think I always have the sense that it's the foundation of the whole thing, and it isn't necessarily, you know, everything that's going to be explored in the book isn't necessarily going to pop up in that first chapter, but I feel that it does, and I feel that unless I've got a handle on exactly what it is I'm doing on that first page, I can't move on.
Especially with your first book.
That habit.
Especially if it's your first book and you're just like, I don't even know if I'm going to make it to the end of this like gargantuan undertaking. You end up just polishing and polishing. I think, yeah, we've all done it. Just going over the first line, the first paragraph, just over and over and over again until you're thoroughly sick of reading it, quite frankly.
And it may never see light of day. I mean,
yeah. Or you just bin the first chapter entirely and then, we'll just start here instead, yeah.
Yeah, that's where the story starts. But I mean, I was so proud of the first line of The Space Between the Stars. And then my agent, Lisa, said, I really, really don't like that first line. And I said, oh, okay then. And I changed it. And then in the editing process, I said to my editor, well, I did really like that first line, but Lisa didn't. And I told her what it was. And she went, oh, good God, no.
I was going to say that it's
learning to kill your darlings moment, isn't it? That's what they mean.
Just so pleased with it.
I was going to say, Anne, that the sometimes it's not until the end of the book that you've written that you realise what it's about, and I think that first chapter you can kind of leave it when you start, and going back and revising it is actually very important, I think, because that first page, that first line, really has to ask the questions that you're going to be talking about throughout the book, I think.
Yeah, I think that's probably right, that in its finished form it is the foundation of the whole book, but in the writing process it's probably not for me.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, I just need to get my head around that.
Have you ever heard of the I can't remember who wrote the essay, but it's the madman, architect, judge and carpenter. You ever heard of those? It's the 4 stages of being a writer, and I honestly, I wish I could remember who wrote it. Basically, you cannot be more than one of those people at any one time. So you should always write your first draft as the madman, and then step back and be the judge, and then be the architect when you want to plot, and then the carpenter when you get down to the level of the sentence. I think there's quite a lot of wisdom in that, especially when it comes to things like first chapters. And I certainly found that learning that was what was hardest for me when I wrote my first book, which was staying away from revising when I was actually writing, you know, spending 5 hours on a single paragraph when you don't even know what the story's about yet. Learning to do that really, I think I didn't even read that essay until I'd written my first book, but I wish I had, because it makes such a difference to my writing now.
Yeah, I think there's a psychological aspect, picking up on what Anne said. You have to have the beginning in place for you as a writer, but that's not going to be the final beginning. It's the first beginning, if you like.
Yeah.
You know,
I'm completely the opposite. The completely opposite challenge, which was I got to my agent wanting to. This is with the first book, wanting to send it out to publishers, and after a bit of an exchange, the upshot was I need to rewrite the entire second half of the book because it's just not working, because the tendrils of the ending start, you know, way back. So you can't just lop the ending off. You've got to start, you've got to cauterize all the way back, sort of near the middle of it. So I literally just like Ruin's Wake, like the full half of it got cut because it just wasn't working. And I wrote a completely different ending, which was like hard in that it was dispiriting because you're like, oh, I've got to rewrite half of the book here, and it's not even out, you know, for sort of publishers sort of review yet. So that was quite hard. But so I can appreciate the start of it being quite hard. But yeah, Adrian was saying it's you don't know until you got to the end whether it's all going. So you're like, oh, yeah, the endings are also a tricky proposition.
I can throw in a sort of practical my side of the thing if you like,
yeah.
Which will terrify people, I suppose, to an extent. But you know, when I started as an editor, having come from bookselling, you know, the publisher that I reported into, when he was asking me after my first month or two, you know, how the submissions coming, I was going, oh, they're great. You know, I'm trying to, you know, make sure I give them all a decent, you know, at least 100 pages read. And he went 30 max, 30 pages max. If you're not feeling it in the first 30 pages, bin it onto the next one, you know, and that is a hard reality. And I think for agents, it's going to be, you know, what one hears anecdotally that it's even more so because, you know, a good agent could be getting 10 submissions a day, you know, and they've got to get through them very quickly. So if the opening of a book, especially for an unagented or an unpublished author, isn't a good piece of writing, even if it's not the necessarily the final version that it might be, it is very difficult because, you know, you get people saying, you know, please make sure please do read my whole book, you know, please, you know, get to the end. And the reality is that most of us don't have time to read every single submission we get all the way to the end, because you might get 20 or 30 a week, you know, and
but you can tell pretty quickly, like within a page or two, if you don't like it. And that's
I think that's
a handy check too.
But I mean, we'll always look for quality of writing, I think, you know, as well as where the story's going. So, you know, you might say, okay, well, maybe this isn't the ideal form for this opening, but the writing's really good and I like it. And the story's cool.
That's really interesting, Michael, because do you find then that, because we've already talked about how we've all gone over the beginning like over and over and over again, do you ever get the sensation that like the first few pages are just like, oh, I can see how they torture themselves over this, and then when they finally get going, maybe in that the last sort of like 20 pages of your 30-page section, you're like, okay, now I can actually appreciate as an editor what this person can bring?
Yeah, I think so. And I think one of the big things is prologues, because, you know, most editors I've spoken to have a love-hate relationship with the prologue, you know, and authors do often like, especially in fantasy fiction and science fiction and crime fiction to an extent, where the prologue can often be a part of the actual structure of the you know, the discovery of the body or the actual murder happening. And then the investigator might appear in the second chapter or whatever. So there is an aspect to prologues, and often not the best part of an unpublished book. You know, they're often the weakest part of a book, not always by any standards, but it can be the case. So if you're reading that first, you might think, oh. So I always kind of like read the prologue with the kind of, I'm reading this to get to chapter 1, and then chapter 1 will be the bit that I'm really kind of, you know, looking forward to, because often the writing can radically improve, you know, from that point to another, because that first bit might be necessary from a sort of expositional point of view, but from a storytelling point of view and narrative prose, it may not be the best example of the writing. I've had some quite exciting conversations with authors about prologues, but yeah, you can find that things pick up, you know, after those first couple of chapters, you know, when you've done the opening and you're ready into the sort of the rising action, for want of a better term. You know, you do find people get into the swing, they hit their pace, you know, and it does improve. Yeah.
Primi.
This has been a really interesting discussion for me, because I never seem to have as much trouble with beginnings. I'm the other way. I have trouble with endings. And so for my debut novel, which I found a copy of on the floor next to my desk, it was actually written as a standalone, and then my agent pitched it as a trilogy, and then my lovely publisher bought 2 books. So how do you end? So we went back, and I was like, well, I didn't write a series. I wrote a book that ends at the end of the book. And my agent was like, yeah, that sounds tough. Good luck with that. Okay.
Sounds like a bartering arrangement. I'll give you 1. No, 3. Well, what about 2?
No, 2. Right. So now I have to, you know, now we had to go back to the end of the book and be like, possibly some of these threads have to be unpicked a little bit so that they can be picked up in another book. And I had never written a series. And to me, that's the hardest thing so far, is writing basically fanfic of the first book, because that's what a sequel is, more or less.
Well, that's a really interesting challenge. Okay, now for the final revolution, we are going to, let's see, we're going to keep Primi, Anne and Adrian, and yes, and we're going to invite back Gareth, Aliette, and yeah, and that should be, yeah, that's right. That should be right. Yeah.
Okay, so I will.
Michael.
Demote or disappear, or whatever we're calling it. Michael.
Beam me out.
Beaming you out. And Paddy.
Bye.
And Derek. We've kept one of the Canadians. Very much Southwest England and Canada theme going on with this.
There we go. What can we say?
I need to find the people I need to put back in again in the list. Gareth and Aliette. They should be at the top.
Yes, Gareth, Aliette.
They should be on their way in. There we go.
Excellent.
Gareth is mute. Mute. There we go.
Okay. Now, I think we've talked about beginnings. I saw a question passed in the feed. What about bits in the middle? We've talked beginnings. We've talked endings. What about the
marshes? That's where you get lost.
Yes. This is the doldrums. The wind drops. You are stuck in the sea.
Yeah.
There's a piece by Neil Gaiman on being in that part of the novel and being stuck there. And this, you know, we obviously the beginning hooks the reader. everybody wants a satisfying conclusion, whether that is just to bring the book to a close or, as in previous case, to open up the possibility of a follow-on. But the bit in the middle, and that's often the bit that sometimes readers sometimes say, yeah, it's slowed down a bit in the middle, but from the writer's perspective, I think that dip is much deeper.
I can talk about this a little bit. I'm very aware of that, and I've been there a couple of times, and I hate it. And I think that's the reason why I've become a hardcore plotter. I mean, I've tried pantsing a few times, but I just find myself lost at sea. So I bought this big A1 drawing board, which every book I write, I plot out in detail, the various scenes, and I try and keep the pace going between, especially in that middle bit. There's a big bit in the middle where I spend a lot of time, sketching and scribbling. That's the bit where I really try to engage the most, to avoid that drifting sensation. And I wouldn't be able to do that if I didn't think about everything up front. I know it's not for everyone. A lot of people prefer to, let the writing lead them, but it just doesn't work for me.
So there's a personal aspect there that it's for you. It's more for. Would you say it's more for you than the book? Although obviously it's difficult to separate them there. It's for you. It's to allow you to create the book. Yeah, exactly. Because I hate it when I don't enjoy writing. When you get to that point and you're just not enjoying it anymore, you need to keep your own interest in the book going. And if I lose that thread, it comes out in the writing, definitely. I've had to the last Dog on Earth. I would say it's been 3 or 4 different books in its drafting process because of a middle. Getting stuck in that middle bit. So yeah, that's definitely for me.
I wanted to jump in on that. Adrian talking about his technique. I was very much a pantser, and I think in a lot of ways it was a much more fun way to write. But I'm just not very good at plotting, and I got myself, like I say, really bogged down. And then I read a really interesting article in one of the writing magazines, I think it is Writing magazine, about the James Elroy, the author of LA Confidential, who said that he wrote, I think it was a 10,000 word summary before he started, and then he converted that into a 40,000 word summary, quite detailed, sort of down to kind of, how people were looking at each other, what sort of the emotions were. And I thought I might give that a go, and I did it for The Space Between the Stars. I think I compromised on about 20,000 word, and it was a bit of a game changer in terms of getting through the thing. So I've done that ever since, and it has finished up being really quite drilling down quite hard into what's happening. So in terms of somebody's looking at somebody in a particular way because this is what's going on in their head, and then odd little bits here and there with actual sort of snippets of dialogue. And it does keep you going. It is less fun, I've got to say.
I find I can't do that because every time I write a detailed outline, by the time I'm in chapter 3, I've completely diverged from it and gone off, and the characters have made different decisions, and I've ended up, so far away from, the outline I gave to Solaris Books for the Akak Makak novels bore no relation to what I delivered at all. So I find I tend to write a 2 or 3 page outline, just like a sketch map with a couple of good plot points I want to get to, and then I sort of go off-road and negotiate my way to those plot points, but try and let the story organically lead me as well, which it does have the disadvantage that I do occasionally sag in the middle where I think, oh God, what the hell am I going to do next? But it's still, for me, if I have a completely detailed outline, I feel that I've already written the story and I lose the impetus to go through it. It just feels like typing then.
I think that's an interesting one, because sometimes there is that feeling of, I've now described the story, I've told the story, and so what else is there to do? But at the same, and the point you highlight is potentially no plan of battle survives contact with the enemy. But the Akak trilogy is one thing, but your Embers of War, I'm intrigued by, just out of interest, was the experience of that as similar, given that all 3 titles, the titles were in place, so clearly there was a responsibility to live up to the title. and there's a theme with respect to each book. Has that followed a similar experience, or has that diverged as wildly as Akak?
No, I mean, when we sold that trilogy to Type, we sold it as a trilogy, and the first book existed in written form, and the second two books existed as a paragraph description each of roughly what they were going to be, and I made the rest of it up as I went along.
It's interesting what you said there, Gareth. I definitely think no, you can plot too much, I suppose, and you can lose that kind of instinctive instinct to your writing. Have you ever heard the story from John Logan, who wrote Gladiator, screenplay writer of Gladiator? That he knew that he had to have a scene with I can't remember the name, but the Emperor and his sister, whoever those characters were, because they'd never been in a room together, and he didn't know what the scene was going to be, but he started writing it at 4 a.m, and they ended up kissing. You know, it wasn't part of the plot, but that turned out to be a very pivotal moment in the whole film, and that, I suppose that wouldn't have been done through the plotting.
I mean, I'm going to come in at the other end of this because I'm an engineer, and I'm very used to the mentality that it's very easy to fix something in like outline form, and then the deeper you get into the drafting process, the bigger mess you make when you're trying to fix it. So I'm very much an architect type of writer, which is I will plot my novels in excruciating scene by scene detailed outline that is like 15 pages long, because A, I know where I'm going, B, I don't have as many surprises when I'm writing. I don't actually like surprising that much when I'm writing, and C, I'm trying to keep my word count under control, which is a little easier if I have a sort of detailed list of scenes. The one thing I do when I'm writing is I will rewrite the outline as needed. If in chapter 3 or chapter 4 I introduce this brand new character who suddenly decides that they want to stab this other character and it was not in the outline, I've tried forging on and it doesn't work. So the compromise that my brain and I have agreed on is I will rewrite the outline. I will stop and go like, okay, well, now this character is dead. What happens? And I will redo the outline and go, okay, this happens. And I will, like, I've had 5 or 6 different outline versions when I was writing my latest book, for instance, because it kept changing and people kept doing unexpected things on me. And the only thing that gets really vague in the outline is the ending. Like when we hit the climax, generally it's like one sentence. It's like, in this chapter, our heroes save the world. I will figure out when I get there. Usually I get there and then I look back and I'm like, thanks, past self. That was really useful. How do I get them out of trouble now?
Yeah, it's the standard engineering diagram. Here, problem. Here a miracle occurs. Solution. Yeah.
Pretty much. But I mean, I guess I've been traumatized by like I changed the gender of a character in a novel, and there were bits and pieces left all over the place, and I was like, I am not doing that again if I can avoid it. Obviously, if I have to do it, I will do it, right? But I'm like, if I already have a good idea of where I'm going, then I might as well apply this. And I guess there's a point where knowing everything that happens gets boring, but I've never really hit that point. I am coming very much from the at least in the old period Chinese novels, it actually tells you everything that's happening in the chapter. So it's like 2 characters are going to have this interesting conversation, and it doesn't actually, I found out that didn't lessen the enjoyment for me, because half the fun was finding out about how it would happen exactly rather than the event itself. And that's something I've taken very much to heart in the way that I'm writing. I'm like, okay, these 2 characters are gonna have a conversation, and then one of them is gonna, I don't know, kiss the other, for instance. And yeah, okay, I don't really know how that's going to happen exactly, but half the fun is going to be finding it out on a smaller level than big novel-wide events.
It's like a précis or even a trailer of this is what's coming.
Yeah.
So if you want to know what's coming, how it unfolds, how do these connect, how does it happen? I think that's the thing that keeps the reader reading.
Yeah, but I mean, having said that, I will say that, you know, when I handed in the, I think the most notable book where that happened was Heart of Binding Thorns, the second book in my trilogy. I handed in the summary to my editor, which was 3 paragraphs of this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. They went off and they did the cover based on that. And I hadn't written a word of the novel when they got back to me with the cover. And then about a third of that outline went out the window when I was writing the book. So I'm like, well, it's a good thing that they didn't choose that particular plot line to illustrate, because there is no mysterious drug investigation being done by half the characters. They don't actually care anymore about that. So, I mean, it does change a bit as I'm writing. It's just that I just, you know, need to update my blueprints as that happens, rather than go like, there is no blueprint. My brain just goes, no, that's scary. I can't do that.
I've always thought a good idea for a film would be just a first draft of a book. So to shoot the film with all the mistakes and continuity errors and you know, characters dying and then coming back. You know.
And a long, slow intro, probably with a prologue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you know that you skipped 3 days somehow and you haven't noticed it, or your characters haven't slept in like 48 hours and they seem fresh and they haven't eaten anything either.
Weather changing halfway through a scene. Yeah.
People love pointing out continuity errors in films. You know, there are pages dedicated to these, but you know, it would be one big continuity error in that sense.
I had a character in The Space Between the Stars who I did like him, but it just really wasn't a job for him to do, and I kept trying to put him back in. And like Aliette saying about having to go back and alter the detailed summary, I tried not to do that. So he went into a room one day on the spaceship and just never came back out again, and nobody ever mentioned him again. No one said, you know, hey, where's Davy? And a bit later on, I didn't rewrite the summary. I thought, oh, I could get Davy back in. So I think I put him in prison somewhere, and then changed my mind again, and we just abandoned him. And then I had another last ditch attempt to get Davy in. I think his name had changed by then. At the very end, sort of dramatically popping up in a dark alleyway. And then again, nobody ever mentioned him again. So I think he'd be quite useful in a movie like that. Like, die again. I was like a bit sad. Just on his chair somewhere in a room.
People walk into our lives and they leave, and that's it, you know.
It's Davy.
Yeah. So I'm going to say that we have reached the end of the 5th revolution. I think that the revolving panel, we managed to get through a remarkable amount, touched on quite a lot on writing mechanics, genre workings, and some great recommendations and insights there, whether you're a reader or a writer. I think there's absolutely loads to be able to take away from this. I think Anne's going to try and bring everybody back for, you know, that kind of like, you know, end of show moment where we're all present, and maybe talk about a couple of other things before we go into breakout rooms and the like.
I'm just very carefully going through the list of attendees in alphabetical order to make sure I don't actually leave somebody sitting out. Oh, no, yes. I thought I just promoted somebody entirely at random there. Yes, if you're in the audience and you suddenly appear on the panel, sorry, that's just me trying to be quick.
Finale jazz hands.
This is where we do the song.
Yeah, we all link arms and
I'm going for the one from Life of Brian. I think is that everybody? Have I missed anyone? If I've missed you and you're in the chat, can you just shout? Is there anyone I should have there that I don't have? Don't think so.
I think we're good.
Right, yes, I have everybody. Oh, it's me now, I think, isn't it? Yes,
yes it is. Sorry, yeah.
And I was like, why is he not talking? Okay, well,
not talking because why is Anne not talking? Yeah.
We're coming up to the end of the panel. A couple of little bits of housekeeping. So the final part of the sort of the main bit of the event is the breakout rooms, where we're going to break down a smaller group with the audience, give people a chance to chat to each other. As soon as I hit end the meeting, can the attendees then immediately click on the second link to go into the breakout rooms? Can the panelists all wait 1 minute before doing that? The reason for that is I think I can assign everyone to breakout rooms with one automatic button press. But I can then, if the panelists then come in afterwards, I will only have them on my list to make sure I put one in each room, if you see what I mean, or some rooms will have two. So just 1 minute for the panelists, please. Attendees.
Additional note, as the attendees, if you're wondering whether or not you wanted to do this, yes, you do. It was an absolute blast last time. Just randomly finding yourself in a room with other people, who knows where, is actually quite delightful.
And I can't promise you won't be grabbed away mid entrance and dumped into another room, but I'll do my best. So we just wanted to wrap up with just a few little announcements of things that are going on. So some of it's been put in the chat window. So Rebellion, who, as you've heard, Michael Rowley publishes quite a few of the attendees on the panel, so quite a few of the panelists. They've put on, to accompany this event, a ebook store sale for each of their participating authors. So some of their ebooks will be on for just $1.99 until Monday. So I will tweet the link to that, and I will also send it by email to anyone who's attended. So it's solarisbooks.com. He's asked me to flag up that even though it shows up in pounds, it is available across the world. So for Sarah Hillary, her first standalone book, I think she's mentioned this already, Fragile, is going to be published by Pan Macmillan in spring next year, and is quoted as Rebecca meets the Handmaid's Tale, which sounds very interesting. Premi is doing a Reddit fantasy Ask Me Anything on Sunday, if anyone wants to look in on that. She's just had one of her books out in audiobook format. That's The Apple Tree Throne, available on Amazon. And she's also flagged up a Kickstarter that's running for special limited edition copies of an anthology that she's in. It's a finalist for a Stoker Award, and they're hoping to reach stretch goals. That's on Kickstarter. Again, I'll send the links round. Adrian Walker has also mentioned his next book, The Human Sun, is out on the 30th of April. Tagline, 500 years in the future, Earth is a paradise without us. Publishers Weekly gave it a starred review and described it as rigorous as a thought experiment as it is delightful as pure entertainment. Mike Carey, the book of Coley, his most recent book, was out on Thursday, I think, Mike?
Yep.
He did a live launch, which was great. Paddy Edwards has recently had his second book out, Echo Cycle. And I believe his first book, Ruin's Wake, has been nominated for a Prometheus Award alongside Margaret Atwood's The Testaments. Shall we all make the ooh noise? Ooh. We've also got Sanjida, 1 year later. Her latest psychological thriller is out at the moment, is 99p for a limited time on Kindle. And her historical fiction novel, The Priest and the Lily, has just been launched as an ebook. She describes it as immersive enough to take everyone's mind off the pandemic for a nanosecond. And Jonathan's new book was also out on Thursday, Riddle of the Fractal Monks. I was about to go with Trouble with Archie and Pie. That's the first one. And he's actually done a promo video, which I can tweet the link to.
I was very tempted to run it as my background, but it might be a bit off-putting.
And I would allow to have screen sharing. And there was one more thing I was going to mention. Oh yes, and Cheryl Morgan, who's in the audience, has just asked me to flag up that Wizard's Tower is putting out a free short story every week during lockdown. Again, I'll send the link to that. It's wizardstowerbooks.com, and they've just published a new novel, wizardtowerbooks.com/shop/unjust cause. So that's all the announcements. I hope you will enjoy the panel, and I'm about to end the meeting, and we will see you in the breakout sessions. Okay, 3, 2, 1.
Bye.
Bye.